In December 1852, the Oak Ridge estate in Brunswick County, Virginia, was sold at auction for a fraction of its value. The stipulation in the sale was unusual. Certain rooms in the main house were to remain permanently sealed, their contents destroyed without examination. The buyer, a merchant from Petersburg, thought it an eccentric request but agreed readily enough. What did he care about locked rooms in a house with 20 others? Within 3 years, he'd sold the property at a loss, claiming the place made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. The next owner lasted 18 months, the one after that, less than a year. By 1860, Oak Ridge Estate had changed hands 6 times, each owner reporting the same vague unease, the same sense that something terrible had happened there. During the Civil War, the main house burned under circumstances never explained. Today, nothing remains except crumbling foundations hidden beneath decades of Virginia forest. Local historians know that a plantation once stood there, that the property belonged to a family named Whitmore, that something happened in 1851 and 1852 that led to the family's complete disappearance from society, but the details were systematically erased. Court documents were sealed and then lost. Personal letters were destroyed. Even newspaper accounts from the period are strangely vague, referring only to unfortunate circumstances and tragedy at Oak Ridge. The truth remained buried for over a century, emerging only through fragments. A diary discovered in an attic in 1947, testimony from formerly enslaved people collected in the 1930s, private correspondence found in Historical Society archives, and when pieced together, these fragments reveal a story of obsession so consuming it destroyed everyone it touched. A story about what happens when human beings are treated as curiosities rather than people. A story that begins with a purchase and ends with death, madness, and a mystery that was never fully solved. Before we continue with this disturbing story of obsession and destruction, make sure you are subscribed. These dark chapters of American history need to be told. And leave a comment with your state or city so I know these forgotten stories are reaching people across the country. The story begins in the summer of 1851, at the port of Norfolk, Virginia, where slave trader Marcus Caldwell had just arrived from Charleston with a coffle of enslaved people purchased at various auctions across the South. Among them was someone who would change the fate of everyone at Oak Ridge Estate, someone whose very existence challenged every assumption of the time. A person the auction records described simply as unique physical characteristics, age approximately 20, purchased from New Orleans, price extraordinary. The person's name was Morgan, no surname, as was common for enslaved people. According to the scattered records that survive, Morgan had been born on a Louisiana plantation, the child of an enslaved woman whose name was lost to history. From earliest childhood, Morgan's body had developed in ways that defied easy categorization. Neither fully male nor fully female, Morgan possessed physical characteristics of both sexes. What modern medicine would recognize as intersex conditions were, in 1851, seen as freakish aberrations, curiosities of nature that could be exploited for profit or scientific study. Morgan had been sold several times before arriving in Virginia. First, to a physician in New Orleans who had documented Morgan's condition in medical journals, treating the enslaved person as a specimen rather than a human being. Then, to a traveling showman who had displayed Morgan in exhibitions alongside other so-called curiosities. Each sale, each exhibition, each examination had reinforced the same lesson: that Morgan existed not as a person, but as a thing to be studied, displayed, and discussed by those who considered themselves normal. When Marcus Caldwell purchased Morgan from the showman for an extraordinary sum, he did so calculating he could sell this unique specimen to a wealthy buyer who would pay premium prices for such a curiosity. He was right. At a private auction in Norfolk attended by Virginia's planter elite, Caldwell described Morgan in terms usually reserved for exotic animals or scientific specimens, emphasizing the rarity, the uniqueness, the opportunity to own something no neighbor could match. The winning bid came from a man named Richard Whitmore, owner of Oak Ridge Estate in Brunswick County. Whitmore was 35 years old, educated from a family that had been in Virginia since the 1600s. He was married to a woman named Margaret, 10 years his junior, daughter of a Richmond tobacco merchant. They had no children, and according to those who knew them, their marriage was polite but distant, each occupying separate spheres with little genuine connection between them. Whitmore paid $2,500 for Morgan, one of the highest prices ever recorded for a single enslaved person in Virginia that year. When asked why he would pay so much, he claimed interest in natural philosophy and medical science, wanting to study this rare condition firsthand. But those who saw his face when he first looked at Morgan recognized something else. Fascination bordering on obsession, a need to possess what he couldn't understand. Oak Ridge Estate was a prosperous tobacco plantation of 1,500 acres, worked by 38 enslaved people who lived in cabins behind the main house. The main house itself was federal style, elegant but not ostentatious, reflecting the Whitmore family's old money conservatism. Richard ran the plantation competently, but without enthusiasm, treating it more as inherited obligation than passion. Margaret managed the household with similar detachment, performing her duties as mistress with mechanical efficiency. It was, by all appearances, a successful, respectable Virginia plantation, home to successful, respectable people living successful, respectable lives. But beneath that surface, both Richard and Margaret were profoundly unhappy in ways neither could articulate. They were two people living parallel lives in the same house, barely touching, barely seeing each other, each isolated in private despair they'd never learned to express. Into this atmosphere of quiet desperation, Morgan arrived in August 1851. Richard installed Morgan not in the slave quarters, but in a small cottage near the main house, a structure that had once housed an overseer. He claimed Morgan's unique nature required observation and documentation, that he would be conducting medical studies requiring regular access. Margaret accepted this explanation without question, as she accepted most things Richard did, with polite disinterest masking her own emptiness. For the first weeks, Richard's interaction with Morgan seemed to follow the pattern he'd described. He would visit the cottage at scheduled times, conducting examinations he claimed were scientific, making detailed notes in a journal he kept locked in his study. He was formal, clinical, treating Morgan as a fascinating specimen. But gradually, something shifted. The visits became longer, less structured. Richard began talking to Morgan, asking questions not about anatomy but about experiences, thoughts, feelings. Morgan had learned long ago that survival meant giving people what they wanted. With the physician, that had meant submitting to examinations. With the showman, it had meant standing still while crowds gawked and pointed. With Richard, it initially meant answering questions about what it felt like to exist between categories, to be neither one thing nor another. Morgan spoke carefully, revealing little, always watching Richard's face for signs of what response was expected. But Richard was asking questions that revealed his own inner confusion. He would talk about feeling trapped in roles that didn't fit, about the suffocating expectations of being a Virginia gentleman, about sensing he was somehow wrong in ways he couldn't name. He seemed to see in Morgan's ambiguous existence a mirror for his own sense of being neither fully what he was supposed to be, nor able to imagine what else he might become. By September, Richard was visiting Morgan every day, sometimes for hours. He would bring books, read aloud, discuss philosophy and natural science. He commissioned better clothing for Morgan, garments that were neither clearly masculine nor feminine but something in between. He began having meals sent to the cottage from the main house kitchen. The enslaved people working at Oak Ridge noticed these changes and whispered among themselves, Something wasn't right. The master was too interested in this new person, too focused, too changed by whatever was happening in that cottage. Margaret noticed too. At first, she was merely curious about what occupied so much of her husband's time. Then, on a warm afternoon in late September, she decided to see for herself. She walked to the cottage, knocked briefly, and entered before Richard could object. What she saw was her husband and Morgan sitting close together, Richard reading from a book while Morgan listened with an expression that seemed both attentive and carefully neutral. Margaret stood in the doorway, and as Richard stammered explanations about scientific observation and research, she found herself staring at Morgan, at the face that was beautiful in a way belonging to neither sex entirely, at the graceful ambiguity of the person sitting there. And something shifted in Margaret, something she'd never felt before, a fascination that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with seeing someone who existed outside the rigid categories that had imprisoned her entire life. "I'd like to meet your subject of study properly," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the strange feeling rising in her chest. What followed over the next weeks was the beginning of something toxic and consuming. Margaret began joining Richard's visits to the cottage. At first, she maintained the pretense of scientific interest, asking questions about Morgan's condition, making observations. But gradually, like Richard before her, her questions became more personal, more revealing of her own trapped existence. She would talk about the suffocating expectations of Virginia womanhood, about feeling like she was playing a role that had been written for someone else, about the desperate loneliness of a marriage that was really just two strangers performing scripts of husband and wife. And she, too, seemed to see in Morgan's existence between categories something that resonated with her own sense of being, neither who she was supposed to be, nor who she might want to become. By October, both Richard and Margaret were spending hours each day at the cottage. They would arrive separately, sometimes together, finding excuses to interact with Morgan. They commissioned more clothing, more books, better furniture for the cottage. They had Morgan brought to the main house for dinner, seated at their table like a guest rather than property, a violation of every social convention that would have scandalized any neighbor who knew about it. The enslaved community at Oak Ridge watched this development with growing unease. They saw how the master and mistress had become obsessed with Morgan, how they seemed to exist now only in relation to this person they'd purchased. Some of the older enslaved people remembered stories about conjure and hoodoo, about people with strange powers who could bewitch their masters. Others dismissed such talk but couldn't explain what was happening any better. For Morgan, the situation was complicated by its own history of violation and objectification. Richard and Margaret weren't cruel in the ways previous owners had been. They didn't display Morgan publicly or conduct painful examinations, but they were still treating Morgan as a thing to be possessed, studied, understood. They wanted to know what Morgan was, as if Morgan was a mystery to be solved rather than a person to be known. The worst part was that Morgan could see their obsession growing and knew where it would lead. Not to Morgan's freedom or humanity being recognized, but to their destruction and Morgan's continued suffering. Because obsessions this intense never ended well. Someone always got hurt. By November, the dynamic at Oak Ridge Estate had become impossible to ignore. Richard had stopped managing the plantation properly. Bills went unpaid. Correspondence piled up unanswered. Neighboring planters who tried to visit on business were turned away with vague excuses. Margaret had stopped receiving social calls, stopped attending church, stopped maintaining even the pretense of her role as plantation mistress. They existed now in a strange, isolated world centered entirely on Morgan. They would spend entire days in the cottage, talking, reading, simply being in Morgan's presence. They began to compete with each other for Morgan's attention, each wanting to be the one Morgan spoke to, looked at, acknowledged. Their marriage, already distant, deteriorated into something stranger. They stayed together not as husband and wife, but as two people sharing an obsession, bound by their mutual need for the same person. The household staff, both enslaved and free, tried to maintain routines, but the plantation was slowly falling apart. Without Richard's oversight, work became disorganized. Without Margaret's management, the household ran on momentum and the initiative of people trying to keep everything from collapsing entirely. It was the cook, an enslaved woman named Dinah who had worked at Oak Ridge for 20 years, who finally tried to intervene. She found Richard in his study late one afternoon, staring at nothing, a glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. "Master Whitmore," she said carefully, "folks are talking. About you and the mistress, about that person in the cottage. It ain't natural, sir, how you were both acting. It's like you were under some kind of spell." Richard looked at her with eyes that seemed to come from very far away. "Perhaps we are, Dinah. Or perhaps we've finally found something real in a world of pretense. Real or not, sir, it's destroying you. And the mistress. And everything else." Richard said nothing, just turned back to staring at nothing. Dinah left, her heart heavy with the certainty that something terrible was coming. In December, Margaret's obsession took a darker turn. She began insisting that Morgan move into the main house, into a room on the 3rd floor that could be locked and controlled. She wanted Morgan always available, always accessible. Richard opposed this at first, but Margaret's intensity frightened him. She'd become someone he didn't recognize, pale and gaunt, eyes feverish with need. Morgan was moved to the 3rd floor room, and the cottage was locked and abandoned. Now both Richard and Margaret had constant access, and they used it. They would visit at all hours, sometimes separately, sometimes together. They would bring gifts, books, clothing. They would sit for hours just looking at Morgan, as if by staring long enough they could understand what they were really seeking. For Morgan, this new arrangement was a fresh nightmare. At least in the cottage, there had been some autonomy, some privacy. Now every moment was surveilled, controlled, claimed by people who saw Morgan not as human, but as the solution to their own inner emptiness. Morgan learned to retreat completely inside, to exist in a dissociated state where nothing felt quite real, where the body that was touched and examined and discussed belonged to someone else. The other enslaved people at Oak Ridge could see Morgan moving through the house like a ghost, eyes distant, face blank. Some tried to reach out, to offer sympathy or connection, but Morgan had gone somewhere beyond reach, somewhere safe from the violations that had become daily routine. By January 1852, the situation had become completely unsustainable. Richard had stopped leaving the estate entirely. Margaret had stopped eating properly, growing skeletal, her once beautiful face now gaunt and haunted. They would both be in Morgan's room for hours, and the servants could hear talking, sometimes arguing, sometimes long silences broken by sounds that were difficult to interpret. The plantation was failing. Predators were becoming insistent. Neighboring planters had stopped all contact, disturbed by rumors of what was happening at Oak Ridge. The enslaved community was preparing to run, sensing that catastrophe was imminent. Then, on a cold February morning, one of the house servants heard a gunshot from the 3rd floor. By the time people reached Morgan's room, they found Margaret's body on the floor, a pistol beside her, half her head blown away. She'd left no note, no explanation, but everyone who'd watched her deteriorate over the previous months understood. The obsession had consumed her completely, and she'd seen no escape except death. Richard found her body first. According to servants who witnessed his reaction, he didn't scream or cry. He simply stood there, looking at his dead wife, then at Morgan standing in the corner of the room, face blank as always. and something in Richard broke, not dramatically, but completely. He walked out of that room and down to his study, where he locked the door and didn't emerge for 3 days. When he finally came out, he was a different person. Hollow. Empty. He arranged Margaret's funeral mechanically, speaking to no one, showing no emotion. She was buried in the family cemetery with minimal ceremony, attended by almost no one. The minister who performed the service later wrote in his diary that he'd never seen a man so completely absent while still technically alive. After the funeral, Richard sold Morgan to a local slave trader for a pittance, getting rid of the person who had been the center of his existence for 6 months, as if Morgan meant nothing. Morgan was taken away in chains, and Richard watched the wagon disappear down the drive without expression. What became of Morgan after leaving Oakridge Estate is unknown. The historical record goes silent, as it so often does for enslaved people. Perhaps Morgan was sold again, passed from owner to owner, enduring more examinations, more objectification. Perhaps Morgan found some measure of freedom eventually, through escape or emancipation. Perhaps Morgan died young, broken by years of violation. We simply don't know. Richard Whitmore lived for 9 more months. He stayed at Oakridge, but he was a shell, going through motions without purpose or feeling. The plantation fell apart around him. Fields went unplanted. Buildings fell into disrepair. Enslaved people ran away in small groups, knowing no one was paying attention anymore. By November 1852, Richard died in his sleep. The physician found no cause of death, no disease, no injury. His heart had simply stopped, as if he'd decided living required more effort than he could manage. The estate was sold at auction to settle debts. The new owner found the 3rd-floor room where Margaret had died, and Morgan had lived, still exactly as it had been the day of the shooting. Bloodstains on the floor that wouldn't come out. Marks on the walls. An atmosphere so oppressive that workers refused to enter. He had it all stripped, the floors replaced, the walls repainted. But the feeling never entirely left. The systematic destruction of records related to Oakridge Estate and the Whitmore family began almost immediately. Relatives embarrassed by the scandal had documents sealed or destroyed. Court records related to the estate's sale mysteriously disappeared. Even the tombstones in the family cemetery were eventually removed, as if erasing the names could erase what happened. But stories persisted. Enslaved people who had been at Oakridge during those terrible months told their children and grandchildren about the master and mistress who had been consumed by obsession with someone who existed between worlds, about how treating a human being as a curiosity had poisoned everything it touched, about how the house had felt wrong after, as if the violence and violation had soaked into the walls. This story reveals something profound about the nature of slavery and dehumanization. Richard and Margaret weren't the stereotypical cruel masters who whipped and beat their slaves. They were educated, refined people who would have claimed to be enlightened in their treatment of enslaved people. But their treatment of Morgan was in its own way just as violent, just as dehumanizing. They saw Morgan as a mystery to be solved, a curiosity to possess, a mirror for their own confusion. They never saw Morgan as a full human being with thoughts, feelings, autonomy, and rights. And that objectification, that refusal to grant full humanity, destroyed them just as surely as if they'd been poisoned. The obsession consumed them because it was built on a lie. The lie that they could own another person. The lie that Morgan existed for their benefit. The lie that understanding Morgan's body would somehow solve their own internal emptiness. And when that lie proved hollow, when the obsession failed to fill the void inside them, there was nothing left but destruction. Morgan, caught in the center of this toxic dynamic, survived through dissociation, through retreating to a place where nothing could touch what remained of self. It was a survival strategy born of necessity. The only way to endure being treated as a thing rather than a person. But the cost was enormous, leaving Morgan fundamentally broken in ways that probably never healed. The story of Oak Ridge Estate is a story about the corrupting nature of treating human beings as property. About how that corruption spreads through everything and everyone it touches. About how obsession born from objectification inevitably leads to destruction. Richard and Margaret destroyed themselves, but not before destroying Morgan, in ways that were perhaps less visible, but no less real. Today, nothing remains of Oak Ridge Estate except a few barely visible foundations in the Virginia woods. The land is privately owned, posted with no trespassing signs. Local historians acknowledge that a plantation once stood there, that something happened in 1851 and 1852, but the details remain unclear by design, erased by people who couldn't bear the shame of knowing what really occurred. But the story deserves to be remembered, not celebrated but remembered, as a reminder of what happens when we treat other human beings as less than human, as a warning about the destructive power of obsession built on objectification, as testimony to the countless enslaved people whose suffering was rendered invisible, whose stories were deliberately erased, whose humanity was denied. Morgan's name appears in a few documents: the purchase records, the estate sale inventory. Nothing else. We don't know if Morgan survived, or how long. We don't know if Morgan ever found freedom or peace. We know only that Morgan existed, suffered, and was then erased from history as thoroughly as the plantation itself. And perhaps that erasure, that silence, is itself a form of violence. The final violation in a long series of violations, to be treated as less than human in life, and then to be forgotten in death, as if the suffering meant nothing, as if the person never truly existed at all. This is why these stories must be told, why the silence must be broken, why we must remember even when the truth is uncomfortable, disturbing, shameful. Because every person who suffered under slavery deserves to be remembered as human. Every story of violation and objectification deserves to be acknowledged, and every example of how treating people as property destroys everyone involved deserves to be understood. The Whitmore family tried to erase what happened at Oak Ridge Estate. They sealed documents, destroyed records, removed tombstones, but the truth survived in fragments, in whispered stories, in the testimony of people they tried to silence. And now, more than a century and a half later, we can piece together what really happened in that house in 1851 and 1852. A husband and wife, trapped in their own inner emptiness, found someone they thought could solve their problems. Someone whose very existence challenged the categories that imprisoned them. Someone they could possess, study, obsess over, and that obsession destroyed them completely, while the person at the center of it all was left broken and then forgotten. Remember Morgan. Remember the Whitmores. Remember Oak Ridge Estate. Not because the story is pleasant, but because forgetting is the final violence. And because understanding how slavery corrupted and destroyed everyone it touched is essential to understanding how its legacy continues to poison us still.